Is my audio okay? No? Test? Test? Okay. So it's already 3 o'clock, so we're going to start now. Thank you everyone for joining us in our 89th episode of the Intramuros Learning Sessions. So for those who are new to our webinar series, so the Intramuros Learning Sessions is the educational webinar series of the Intramuros Administration. Topics are interdisciplinary and cover themes related to Intramuros and Manila studies, as well as Philippine art, culture, and history. Pursuant to the Intramuros Administration's charter, the ILS aims to contribute to the strengthening of the Filipinos' national identity and sense of belonging and pride. So for this episode of the Intramuros Learning Sessions, we are proud to present the second part of our mini-series, Dressing for War. So in the first part of Dressing for War, last May 31, we discussed about military uniforms during the second half of the 19th century with special focus on the Philippine Revolution. In this episode, the second part of Dressing for War and the 89th episode of the Intramuros Learning Session, we're going to talk about military uniforms from the Second World War. And for this uh, presentation, we will feature the Wartime Heritage Guild. So for this episode, we are featuring as well the Wartime Heritage Guild, our one of our official partners in promoting the commemoration and memorialization of our uh, World War heritage. Now, before we start, I'd like to discuss first some house rules. So, for this webinar, you may raise your questions via the Q&A button or the chat button. So, for Zoom attendees, you can use the chat button or the Q&A button. Since our Zoom attendance is quite intimate right now, you can also ask me uh, if you wish to appear on screen, pwede naman po, sabihan niyo lang po ako sa chat, no? And then I can promote you as panelist. Now, for FB viewers, you can raise your questions in the comment section. However, only the Zoom participants are eligible for a certificate. A certificate uh, can be obtained by watching via Zoom and by giving us feedback after the webinar. So for the viewers via Facebook, if you wish to receive a certificate, please you can still join via Zoom. The registration link for Zoom is in the uh, caption of this live feed. Note that this webinar is recorded and the recording shall be made permanently available in IA's social media channels. So our featured speakers for today, so we have three from the Wartime Heritage Guild. So ano po, mga recent photos lang yan. Filter. Buhay pa rin naman sila. They just like reenactment, no? So they're from the Wartime Heritage Guild. So Dan Antonio Jr., Don Fernandez, and Diego Almirante are from are members of the board of the Wartime Heritage Guild. So basically, the Wartime Heritage Guild is an organization of reenactors and period costume enthusiasts. So later, Don, Dan, and Diego will talk more about their organization and the art of reenactment. Now, without further ado, I will now turn over the floor to our speakers. So Dan, Diego, and Don, pasok
Good
na.
afternoon.
Hello.
Thank you.
I suppose Don can kick off the presentation since it's on his laptop.
Yes, of course I will. So,
Yes.
good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon to our audience. I count at least 15 right now. Thank you very much for the Intramuros Administration's invitation, and this is part of their learning sessions. In this way, we would expand the knowledge of our nation's history. That is the objective overall of the Intramuros Administration and also the Wartime Heritage Group. Now, in order for me to kick off, I would like to introduce a bit of the Wartime Heritage Guild. If you would allow me, give me a moment here while I bring in and share you my screen. Okay, there you go. Sing out if anyone could see my screen, please. Okay, there you are. Okay, so this is the Wartime Heritage Group, and our feature for today is dressing for war. In this particular instance, we would be presenting how dressing for war is about in the Philippine context, especially for World War II history in the Philippines. This, of course, would be covering 1941 to 1945, but in the overall scheme of things, this would cover the Commonwealth period of the Philippines. So we would be throwing in a whole lot of information on how our forefathers, particularly those who took part directly in the war, this is how they dressed. We will be featuring, of course, the good guys. That is the U.S. Army and the components of the Philippine Army that were ultimately part of USAFE. And of course, the bad guys as well. That would be the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces. So without further ado, let me throw some things into the mix. All right. Now, of course, the Wartime Heritage Group, as mentioned earlier, is a reenactment group. So we are more of a heritage presentation group and living history. Now, concept of reenactment is, it says so over there, acting out a past event. I'll be mentioning to you how reenactment has been going on for the last 2,000 years or so, and the early examples of the hobby, why we do it, and early examples of how it was done in the Philippines. That's going through from the pre-Hispanic times through to the colonial era, and then on to modern reenactment as it is presenting itself today. Okay, now early examples of reenactment. There were times when, in the classical period, that would be the Roman times, back in Jesus' days, right? Now, the Romans here had the habit of building coliseums, and they would be reenacting battles into them, especially battles of within their own memory, and they would like the rest of the population to remember that. Sometimes they went to the extreme. They would be filling in their coliseums with water, pumping that place full of water, and then they'd be floating their warships into the Colosseum, and they would be reenacting important naval battles in there. That is what they would call a naumachia. Okay, and this carried on until about well past the Middle Ages. And this is a show, this one showing over here what was going on in the Holy Roman Empire with Ferdinand de' Medici, right? This was somewhere in Italy. You would note that they're using actual galleys in there. And bear in mind, people got hurt with these things. But then again, this was also a reenactment as well, okay? Now, even in the past, there were reenactments going on. Elsewhere in the world, you have these prime examples. The Maori. The Maori are, of course, tribal Polynesian people in New Zealand. The Haka. If you would look at the leftmost photo today, they would still be performing the Haka, especially in their when they do their rugby games. Okay, but all of that started when a Maori chieftain challenged his enemies, when he was all alone and he was surrounded, and so he started chanting what is now commonly known as the Haka. And the enemies apparently were so impressed that they let them live. And this became a tradition among the Maori people of New Zealand. Every time that they are facing a challenge, whether physical or emotional, they will do a haka. And if you have watched a haka over YouTube, you will be very visibly impressed. Okay. Now, why do people reenact? In the context of the Wartime Heritage Guild, we reenact to remember past events, to forge a connection with the past, and to honor our ancestors and their achievements, right? So the need to remember past events, we do this because World War II is still within the living memory of the last 1, 2, 3, 4 generations. Okay, people my age, I am 49 years old. I have old people in my neighborhood who, in their youth, experienced the Japanese occupation. And every now and then you would find a very old person who is still who was a survivor of that war, whether as an active participant or as a child. And they would have living memory of that one. Second is to forge a connection with the past. We connect with what our ancestors experienced, okay? And then to honor their achievements and their lives. Okay, now how do we do this in the Philippines? First off is among the pre-Hispanic Filipinos, you have the war dances, especially in the Cordillera region and among the mountain tribes in Mindanao. They have these traditional war dances. Sometime in the past, they had a victory over a particular enemy tribe. And in order for them to commemorate that victory, first they started showing what actions did they undertake, what movements did they do, right? And because of it becoming a habit, and naturally it progressed naturally into tradition. And so it became a war dance. This is most prevalent, especially now, among the Cordillera people, okay? If you would wander off into Bukidnon, the tribal people over there have their own version of a war dance. And even among the Aita, they have a hunting ritual. So they would say, this is how we would perform. This is how we would move in order for us to capture our prey. And so they would feature it in a dance. Okay. Now, in the latter half, okay, we also have the Atihan festival in the island of Panay. It has become a tradition now. It has become a festival. But in the old days, it was a commemoration and an respectful reverence of what happened when the native Ita people welcomed the Malay people who came over from the Malay Peninsula and maybe Indonesia and settled in Panay. So instead of having a big fight, they decided, okay, let us celebrate these newcomers. And so they had dances and feasts. This evolved across time during the Spanish period into commemoration for religious events. They put the Santo Niño into it. And then later on in the 1970s, it became a provincial gig. So now it has become something of a Mardi Gras, okay? A Mardi Gras festival. But of course, the original purpose of it was for the Aita people welcoming the Malay people onto that island, right? Now you also have, we're venturing now into the Spanish era. So every time that you would go to these particular festivals during Holy Week, anywhere in the country, you would see these. Okay, in Pampanga, they have the crucifixion, which is a reenactment, of course, of what the Spanish taught us. Okay, they would show there the crucifixion of Christ, the Passion of Christ, and they would reenact it according to what the Spanish taught them, which itself is based on the Bible. And in the Tagalog places, you would have, I think there's the Tagalog and the mostly Catholic places in the Philippines, but mostly around the Tagalog places, they have the Santa Cruzan. Today, it's a beauty pageant, and whoever sells the most tickets becomes the prettiest person in the parade. But
Mhm.
in the older days, this was actually a reenactment, a commemoration of an Eastern Roman event when Saint Helena, the mother of the Emperor of Rome, went to the Holy Land and rediscovered the true cross. Apparently, it was the actual cross where the Lord Jesus was crucified. And so it became a religious commemoration. In the Spanish times, it became, they transposed it, it became even more religious commemoration. Right now, it's a beauty pageant, but if you would look at the names, you would have there a Santa Helena, and you have a Constantino. Constantino, of course, is the name of the Roman emperor who was the first Christian Roman emperor, apparently. And these parades, they take place, and the names of the characters in that parade, they reflect the names of Santa Elena and the people who were her support group, her court, who went out to the Holy Land to recover the true cross. Okay. And of course, history as a science in relation to modern reenactment. In the Wartime Heritage Guild, we focus more on the material side of history. So what is it that the major participants wore? What is it that they utilized? How did they live with these material things? And how did they adapt to the environment? Now, I would like to point out over here that this is something far deeper than cosplay. Okay, cosplay is cosplay. It is a fantasy in cosplay. The focus of cosplay is on the person doing the cosplay. Now, as opposed to reenactment, a reenactment is using period authentic items or reproductions that are as close to the period items themselves and utilizing them in a way that is expected of that particular time. It is more about the historical event and not about the character or the person doing the reenactment. Okay?
Don,
Yes.
if I were to interject regarding the materials, it's
Mhm.
not just for appearances either. It's so that the
Oh, yeah.
participant can feel how it was like to be in said things. I mean, for let's say theater props, you can have something that looks like, and that's good enough. But
That's correct.
the experience is part of it.
Exactly. I would get to that because we have also the next level. Ultimately, it will be a historical living history. That's where you were going, right?
Yes.
Living history is not only do they use period correct items, these people would go into places far from civilization sometimes and experience or try to relive what was being what is it that they're trying to experience. So with the Wartime Heritage Guild, the last one was in Bamban Tarlac. We tried to live out a bivouac, a small campsite in the manner of the USAFE and the IJA. Prior to that, it was another small campsite in San Rafael in Bulacan, right? And we try to experience, try to utilize to the best of our ability the items that were used on that particular time. Okay, now I'll be passing the presentation over to Diego and Dan, and they will be focusing on the actual dressing up and utilization of the material artifacts pertaining to World War II.
Hi, Don. I'll just say next slide whenever I need the next slide to come up, since
Of course.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right. Next slide. When preparing this presentation, I actually wanted to include these images. They're illustrations from the 15th and 16th century reprints of the treatise De Re Militari. Now, my brother, he likes drawing art. So wait, Don, I think you went one slide too far. The slide, no, wait, yes, there we go. No, forward. There we go. I chose these images because they sort of represent why the material culture and what we know about the particular era we study is important to. It's important to depict things as close as they were, as close to how we know currently with current studies. Because the thing is, with these two images, it depicts a Roman era writer, Vegetius. But since they knew very little about Roman times back then, they depicted him and the Roman soldiers dressed in the same garb as the late medieval period. This was due to a lack of material evidence to back up how the people from back in the day look. And so this is, in a sense, for me at least, in terms of the material of reenactment, the cusp of it, because these people lived maybe 1,000 years after the Roman Empire fell, while we who live 1,500 years after it fell know more about how they acted and how they look because of the advancements in science, in archaeology and history. So that's why I decided to put these two pictures into the presentation, because they really show how far removed people's perception could be of their past just from the lack of evidence, which is something that we are fortunate enough to have today, since World War II and the other conflicts of the past century are well documented and well photographed. Okay, next, Don. Don? I think this would be more of Dan or your specialization. Though we do many, oh wait, Don, I think we advanced one slide too far. The value of the and objective of the modern reenactor is derived from painstaking research of a particular era. But though we do this partly for ourselves to experience how it was like in the past, at least just a fraction of it, we have to apply it. We have to educate people outside ourselves. I mean, we take this experience, we try to experience these things with the material and with our studies, but we have to pass it on to others. So some of the activities include educational talks, such as this one, heritage engagement, like Don said, like we do it Intramuros or other sites, and of course, site immersion, like we did in Bamban. When we went to Bamban, we were in the caves where the Japanese hid. We were dressed as Americans, where the Americans would have been when they were assaulting said caves. There are many others. Dan, would you like to add? Don, would you have anything to add?
So
about our duties as reenactors.
okay, so apart from doing this as self-fulfillment, okay, we also engage in educational talks with people who, like you, are interested in history overall. We also engage in heritage engagement. So not only do we do this because we want to feel things, we also do this to encourage people to remember their own heritage. Among the places that we visit would be, apart from Intramuros, which is a heritage location, we also do this in Angeles, where they have a whole series of heritage structures that are worth preserving, so people would remember what went on in that particular place, and they would commemorate this and integrate this in their own little community. Okay, site immersion. Okay, again, if you have a heritage site and you would the community would like to help others commemorate the site, then we would help them commemorate the site by pointing out what happened here in live action, what happened in this particular location in the period of 1941 to 1945. Okay, so in the overall context of things, Wartime Heritage Guild, through reenactment, presents the narrative. We tried to present also the personal experience, and in that way, we also present factual history. If I will put that in Tagalog, it would mean the narrative, the salaysay. So, salaysay, sariling salaysay, the stories passed down by our past relatives, right? And then there is also the history of things, the kasaysayan. Okay, and apart from the kasaysayan, of course, is the experience, something which is carried deeper with the way we conduct our own thing when we are in persona, the experience, the karanasan. Okay, so salaysay, karanasan, kasaysayan. That is what we present whenever we do reenactments, and it's something else that we would encourage people perhaps to experience as well.
And also regarding that, Don, is educational talks. When we also go to specific places like in Laguna or whatever place, Batangas, ganyan. We also somehow attract people who experience the war, and especially of course, the old people. So we get to um, talk to them, and they actually openly tell us what are their experiences. So it's a plus for us, and also somehow they're happy about it, since that we are commemorating their experiences, or rather we are not forgetting what happened to them. So at least people know that there are people also that are appreciating the heroism of our ancestors, and also even though that may mga civilian din, they know that we never forget about World War II. This it's a dark part of our history, but again, we still have to remember it.
We'd like to point out one event that happened in Bamban, for example. So we have, as you can see in the photographs over there, this would be the IJA component of our group. Dan is included in there. Okay. Now this whole group, you can see in the photographs, are dressed in Japanese uniform. One day we went to Bamban to assist in promoting the Bamban World War II Museum. One of the locals in Bamban, very old lady, she was about 93 years old at that time. So she approached one of our Japanese colleagues, and then she said, "Ay, nabuhay ka pa pala." So it turns out that they had during the Japanese occupation, right? There was a Japanese soldier, perhaps a sergeant or an NCO, maybe an officer, who was friendly with the local children, but toward the end of the war, he was abducted by the local guerrillas,
yes.
and he was tied to a tree and bayoneted to death by the hook, right? And
Yes.
somehow it made when our group went over there dressed as they are in Japanese uniform, it triggered a memory with the old lady, and she said that she all of a sudden remembered that young Japanese soldier who was giving out free candy to them,
Yeah, and
free
milk.
food and milk. Okay, so that is one of the consequences of the site immersions that we do, or the activities that we engage in, is the population locally. They come out with the wartime histories that they have been hanging on to for the last 70, 80 years. And we, as a group, we pick up on it, right? And it becomes an anecdote. And from there, sometimes actual historians would pick up on it as well, because at the end of it all, we would like to learn what I said again earlier, salaysay, right, which contributes to our own kasaysayan. Okay. All right. There you go.
Next slide.
Hang on, my machine is lagging. Okay. Visible?
Okay. The next part, previous one. For the next part of the presentation, before we get to the factors why the Japanese Americans and the Filipinos were dressed or equipped the way they were, where it will be tied in with the historical context of how these countries entered the war. Our second section is divided into three parts: America during the interwar years, the Philippine Commonwealth during its when it was first founded in 1945, and the Japanese, who were already expanding their empire in China during the 1930s. This will be a very, how would you say this? This will be a very generalized overview of the conditions of these countries as they relate to the uniforms and the equipment used at the time. There's only so much time in this presentation. We can't really delve really deep into it, but we'll provide you with the context, the broad context of what these countries were like when they entered the conflict. Next slide. Okay, interwar America. If you could look at the political cartoon on the cover page. I think we advanced one slide too far. You could see Uncle Sam standing on the Western Hemisphere, looking all smug, away from the troubles of the old world, from Europe and the rest of the European major powers. This is because after the First World War, America was gripped by a sense of isolationism. They didn't want to get tangled in the affairs of other countries. Of course, the Monroe Doctrine is added as a tongue-in-cheek, because for the people of Central and South America, as well as in the Philippines, the Americans were still very much willing to intervene. But for most of the 1920s and 1930s, the Americans really didn't want to get involved with great power politics in Europe. They had They had a very different experience of World War I compared to the Europeans. And by the opinion of the general public, they didn't want to get involved in European affairs. Generally speaking, they didn't want to get involved in European affairs. And next slide. Okay, here I posted a few pictures to illustrate my point. There are many factors that affected, in the context of uniforms and equipment, the military spending, the defense policy of the United States during the interwar years. I just listed a few of the major ones here. The first is isolationist foreign policy, which I said the American public does not want to get dragged into the affairs of the major European powers. They looked inwards during the 1920s and 1930s. They didn't although was unprecedented. Although the Americans pushed forward the League of Nations at the end of World War I, they themselves did not participate in its activities. They just abandoned it for the Europeans to manage. They were not active participants of the League of Nations. They really just did not want to get involved in great power politics. This is combined with a lack of public will for military spending. The idea of a large standing army in the United States, it hasn't always been there. When we look at America today, it's a superpower. It has the largest and best funded military currently. But back in the 30s, it was a whole different matter. People were just not willing to spend public funds on sustaining a military that the size of a military that they knew would, since combined with the isolationist foreign policy, they felt like they didn't need a massive military, and so there was lack of will to spend on a massive military. It was hampered by the fact that.
For additional context, if today the U.S. military is the largest, most modern, most well-funded in the world today, in the 1930s, it was roughly the equivalent of Mexico today.
And us. And
Yes.
us, of course.
And us, the Philippine military. It had so few soldiers. It relied on horses, and it had no the tanks that they had were very old World War I models. So the Philippine military today would actually be more would be better equipped than the U.S. Army of the
The
1930s.
1930s.
Okay.
Additional context. In 1940, the American military was smaller than Romania's. A tiny Romania had a larger army than America in 1940. And if you were to look at the American military strength in the mid-1930s, they only had 8 divisions in their army. A division is around 10,000 men, more or less, sometimes 20, but it basically is a unit of military organization. The US Army only had 8 divisions. The Germans 100, the Russians close to 200 in the mid 1930s. So the Americans really did not spend much on their armed force or on their army during the 1930s. It was because of lack of public will, the isolationist foreign policy, and the Great Depression. The stock market crashed in 1929. So there wasn't really much money floating around to spend on the military. So with a reduced budget, the last point on this slide is a Navy-focused national defense policy. Now, I left pictures on this slide to explain each of these points. The lack of public will for military spending, represented by the horse cavalry, the Americans who were still fielding in large numbers in the 1930s. The unemployment lines, the second picture from the Great Depression, since many companies were closing and there weren't as many jobs, many unemployed people. Then, of course, the isolationist foreign policy, no to foreign entanglements. And lastly, if you were to look at the picture on the upper right corner, you see the United States and the rest of the Americas. To its left, you had the Pacific Ocean. To its right, the Atlantic. In the minds of American military planners, if funds are limited, most of it should be spent on a navy, because whatever threat would come against the United States, it'll have to come from the sea. So there was really no impetus to invest in a massive army. Their only potential invaders at the time would be Mexico or Canada. And though there were military plans against them just in case, it was highly unlikely that such an eventuality would push through. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is more or less the 3 pictures here are more or less an overview of the American army as it was just before the war started. You had a few tanks. The Americans, experimented with tanks in the 1930s and mechanized warfare, but they fought alongside traditional horse cavalry. There was a lot of debate whether the US Army should mechanize or retain combat cavalry units. You see the picture on the right. More or less the equipment of the time was defined by the wide-brimmed Brodie helmet from World War I. Well, the Americans called it a Kelly helmet, but generally speaking, most of the equipment, most of the rifles equipment were World War I surplus. While to the left, to the left, you see, that's one exception. To the left, you have an infantryman armed with the relatively new M1 Garand rifle. There's actually a lot of misconceptions floating around that the soldiers here all use Springfields, all use bolt action, that the Garand did not make it in time for combat in Bataan. This was not true. The Americans sent around 8,000 M1 Garand rifles for the battle in Bataan. The United States entered World War II as the least prepared of the great powers. The French were preparing for war with the Germans. The Brits, they always had their presence all over the world in the empire. The Japanese had their war in China. America was the least geared up for World War II. But because of its isolation from the rest of the world, separated by 2 oceans, and because of its massive industrial strength, it will make its power felt as it geared up for the conflict. And next slide. The military history of the Philippine Commonwealth is very much tied to the American experience, because up to that point, before the Philippine Commonwealth came into existence in 1935, the Philippines was an American colony. And so in the time before the Commonwealth's existence, the defense of what were termed the Philippine Islands was the responsibility of the United States Army. But they were preparing, once the Commonwealth, next slide. But once the Tidings-McDuffie Act passed, the Philippine Commonwealth was formed, and it was supposed to prepare the country for full independence in 10 years. Now, that meant many things. That meant structuring a lot of the institutions necessary to run a country. Chief among these was defense. Chief among these was defense, as the National Defense Act of 1935 was Commonwealth Act number 1. The idea of a force to defend the Philippine Commonwealth came into existence, or at least plans for it were made even before the existence of the Philippine Commonwealth. 3 factors played into the structure of the Philippine Commonwealth Army. Well, you had the promise of independence. So basically the army that was being prepared in 1935, this will be the nucleus of what would become the AFP. When the Philippines became independent, this will be the organization and the preparations made at this time would shape the future of the country's armed forces once it attained full independence. And so there was this huge, I guess, contradiction, or there was these complexities when planning the new army. They didn't want to look too far ahead because they didn't have the budget for it. But at the same time, they knew that what they did now would shape the army in the future. So they lacked funds for military expenditure. They had many advisors, chief among them MacArthur, but Eisenhower was also in the Philippines advising the organization of the Philippine Army. And they came to the conclusion that even at the most modest scale, the Philippine Army would need roughly 22 million pesos. This is 1937 pesos. Back in the day, you could buy that's in an Enfield rifle for 18 pesos. That's just to illustrate the rate of inflation. 18 pesos for a rifle. The military needed around 22 to 25 million, even in its most modest form. Quezon could only afford 16 million.
To add some context to the cost, to the modest form, okay? In the assessment of MacArthur, ideally there should be at least 12 divisions of the Philippine Army, 12 active regular divisions of the Philippine Army, okay? The government of Quezon can only afford at most 3, and that is stretching the budget. If they wanted to make a well-equipped army, maybe it was only 2 divisions. That's about 20 to 25,000 men in total, right? And that is just the ground forces. You still have to factor in the aircraft. The modern ones for that period were prohibitively expensive. And then, of course, you need to have a navy. Even then, they had to rely on a coastal patrol, which they pulled from the Philippine Constabulary. So it was very expensive to maintain an army. It's still expensive to this day. And that controlled the manner by which the military was equipped. Okay? And the equipment, of course, that is how we reenact things, is how we could perform any particular military objective with the kind of equipment that that was set aside for the Philippine military at that time.
To wrap up the section on the Philippine Commonwealth's Army, I think the standard Philippine Army soldier of the time is best exemplified by the picture in the middle over there. On their heads, they had the Guinea helmet. Now, we were slated to have steel helmets by around 1942, 1943. But before that, none were supplied, and we really could not afford it. So we basically used the sun protection helmet for the sun protection helmet from the uniform regulations as our primary headwear. Ginit is a form of coconut fiber. So basically, when our troops went to war, they were wearing Ginit helmets. They were useful for protection against the sun, but ballistics-wise, no. And the rifles, they're the M1917 Enfields. They were World War I surplus. They were really long and really heavy, really unsuited for us. And a lot of them were shipped here with weak extractors. So at one point during Bataan, many of these rifles would fail and would basically act as single shot rifles because the previous shells, when you fire them, would not extract properly. And next slide, Don. So overall, this is the picture of what the Philippine Army of pre-war and early war period, the pre-war and early war period was like. We were highly motivated. We were steered towards independence. It was there, but the money and material was not. But we tried to make do with what we had. The Philippine Army did not exist 6 years before World War II. And during World War II, even the mightiest countries were devastated by the war, let alone a small country like ours. But we tried our best to defend our country. And next slide, Don. I think this is the part with the Japanese experience.
I'd like you all to look at the rightmost photograph over there, okay, and compare it with the people in the middle. The photograph in the middle, these gentlemen are part of the first batch of reservists that were called up for to prepare for Japanese invasion. More or less, they're nicely dressed, okay? They have more or less standard US Army equipment. This is pretty much the same equipment that the US Army had and was supplying to the Philippine divisions at that time. Now, if you would look at the ones to the right, the ones to the right over there, that's an artillery, a Philippine Army artillery unit. You would note the color is darker, okay? They are not wearing khaki. They are wearing blue denim, maong.
Maong, yes.
Regular maong cloth. That's how poor the Philippines was. They subcontracted the manufacture of maong for Philippine Army uniforms because it was by far the toughest fabric. That was also the cheapest. And the only problem, of course, was that it was indigo blue. Now, over time, they would launder that. It pales out. But that was the supply situation at that time. The group, the Wartime Heritage Guild, of course, does have a set for this kind of an impression. It's not much known, but the troops in the majority of the Philippine soldiers in Bataan wore a mix of this khaki, which wore out very quickly, and of course you have the blue denim, the maong over there, which was more or less common because it was cheap, easy to manufacture, and the government didn't have to worry about loss when it comes to that. You would note that some of the soldiers, especially on the right picture, Dago made a good example of the ginit that they're wearing, those sun helmets. Those are easily ruined, okay? If you drop them, they break or they would crack. And if you lie down, you can't sit down on them, not like steel helmets.
They only had a service life of around 6 months before they needed replacement.
Yep. But if you would look at the hat, the others are wearing the Huawei style. We would call them the sun cap, the slouch hat.
Or the daisy hat.
The Daisy May hat.
Daisy May hat.
Yeah.
Just to interject also, Don, regarding about the blue denims.
Mhm.
The time that I spoke with retired Master Sergeant Dan Figuracion, he mentioned that he's a Philippine Scouts, by the way. Rest in peace to Dan Figuracion. When he saw the Philippine Army wearing those blue denims, running away from the Japanese lines, he really feels sorry about them because, of course, you're a sore thumb when you're running inside the jungle. So, kitang-kita kayo. It's a bright blue denim actually pag yung naarawang kayo. So it's like an easy target for the Japanese. And yun nga, the Philippine Scouts are a different unit. They're more elite. But the Philippine Army who were wearing these blue denims are pretty much on a sorry state in that situation.
And they formed the majority of the men who fought in Bataan. The Philippine Scouts was a relatively small unit. Most of the men would be like the ones pictured here.
Yes, that's correct.
Yep. Okay, Dan, the next slide is yours.
Yeah. So Japanese imperial expansion. As we all know, during that time, when Japan actually sealed up from the Western world or the Asian world, the time that they opened their country, of course, the American influence, all the foreign Western powers actually parang inoffer nila yung services nila to strengthen their army. So because there's of course yung threats from China, from Korea and all Mongolia, all those threats and Russia of course. That's why they feel that they need to expand and strengthen their army.
Mhm.
So
This is the context behind the need of the Japanese to expand their armed forces was because um, in 1841, when the American Navy under Commodore Perry arrived in Japan, he practically forced the Japanese to open their country for trade. So he pointed his U.S. Navy ships at the Japanese and said, "Open up." Okay, so he forced the Japanese to open to the world, and the Japanese, of course, they had a quandary, and they decided, we don't let this happen again, that we would be forced by a Western power to open our country. So they decided to modernize, and to modernize as fast as possible. Bear in mind, these are the samurai class that were running Japan. It was ruled by the shogun. He was a military dictator. So he was telling the rest. It came to the point where he said he had to leave because the samurai class said, "We have no choice but to modernize." Right? It's the military classes of Japan that urged the modernization of Japan. It wasn't the civilian classes. Okay, so that would provide a bit of context to why the Japanese were so militaristic uh, from the 1930s, from the 1920s up until they were defeated in 1945. Yes, sir,
that's
Dan.
correct. Yeah. So next slide, please. So yeah, by the time that Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Japan, of course, has already endured over 4 years of war. There's syempre may threat from Russia. So that's why there was a Russia-Japan war. And of course, from Manchuria to Indochina or Indochina, the empire sought to expand its holdings through south, displacing America, of course. Um, they think that the Western countries that has territories or colonies in Asia is actually a big threat for them. So the first thing that they did, of course, is expand through China, through Manchuria, and of course, later on establishing their own uh, puppet government, which is the Manchukuo, and also in the other countries like in Indochina and Vietnam, Thailand, those countries that they uh, try to um, liberate from the Western powers and somehow yeah, what they call as a Great Asian Core prosperity because giving you the liberty, but still uh, they will actually they'll be the one is still in power, even though that the so-called core prosperity. Anyways, on this photos that you can see, that's the early uniforms that they have on the left side. The during the Meiji and Taisho era. So these uniforms are based on influence from the French, and then later on the British and Americans. By the way, the Japanese Navy also has a different culture, which is based on British Navy. And for the Japanese infantry or army, they're also influenced by the American and French. And you can see also on the second photo here is I believe that this is in Alaska. the occupation of Alaska, or was this Alaska, Don, or is this in Manchukuo, in Manchuria?
I think it's in Manchukuo.
That's in Manchukuo, yeah. So that's
With the camels.
yeah, yeah.
The
So
camels are Mongolia.
Mongolia. So yeah,
Yeah.
upper north portion, and
This
then
is northern China along the Mongolian border because Nomonhan.
yes, Nomonhan,
Nomonhan.
yes. So yeah, you can see also the samples of how the uniform actually have changed from the early war up to this third photo, which is I believe that they're wearing a Type 3 uniform. This uniform has already been used in China, and you can see also the captured weapon. That's a machine gun or light machine gun. This is a Czech built machine gun, ZB-26. So likely this is a captured weapon when they occupied China, because during that time, of course, China is also benefiting from the Western world. They have weapons from different countries, and that was utilized thoroughly by the Japanese when they occupied China. And of course, let me just check the fourth photo is likely this would be the during 1942. So that's you can see that's a tropical uniform already that they're wearing, and it's like this was already worn all throughout the war in the Pacific, because of course the humidity, especially here in the Philippines, they eventually use the more summer type uniforms due to protect from heat, of course. And same way with it's the same uniform that they also use all throughout the South Pacific. So next slide, please. Okay, so you can see also as Japan kicked off in the Pacific War, it possessed the most experienced military force in the region. So yes, they act quick, and the precision and also the determination of the military men, or the Japanese Imperial Army. And that's why even the British was taken over, especially in Singapore, as you can see on the left photo with Yamashita, General Yamashita, and also you can see the British flag and white flag, and also the photo of the this is not the surrender, but this is actually this is in Bataan. It's more up this they're talking about uh how to turn over, and what would be the it's like what will happen to the troops if they surrender. So
Yep.
that's
The
General,
terms of
yeah, the terms,
surrender.
yeah. So that's General King, right?
Yes.
So
Yes, Edward.
So
Yes, Edward King.
Edward, yeah.
there is a lot of many stories from this one photo. This one, it's often captioned as the American surrender. This is
Yes.
not the actual American surrender. This was the
Yes,
negotiations
yes,
for
negotiation, that's
surrender.
correct.
The
Yes.
actual surrender was further to the coast. I think it was Limay. This photograph is
Yes.
in Balanga. Okay.
Yes.
The Balanga, unfortunately, right? The story in the Balanga is just half the story. It's not the actual surrender itself. It is the negotiations for the surrender. Right.
Yes. And also the third photo, of course, this is in Corregidor. It's the iconic photo of the Japanese winning the war over Corregidor, because it took a lot of toll against the Japanese before they could actually take this island. So yeah, and for a moment,
Just to add another
yeah.
thing, when the Americans in Bataan surrendered, the USAFE, that includes Filipino and American soldiers, surrendered in the Bataan side. These were the ones who took part in the death march. Okay. The ones who surrendered in Corregidor were 1 month after, more or less. So they did not participate in the death march. They had a death march all their own. Okay. And for the most part, they were they were better fed in a way, right? But at the end of the day, they received no, they received the same kind of treatment that the ones at Bataan received. Okay.
Yes, and of course, as Japan kicked off the Pacific War, it possessed the most experienced military force in the region. Of course, because most of them came from China when they waged war in China, and of course, most of the soldiers that was sent here are experienced, uh, based in Taiwan and China or mainland China, and
Basically,
mhm.
the Allied forces they faced, they were more or less on colonial duty, policing the empire, like in Malaya or Singapore. They had no combat experience. The Japanese troops had all the combat experience.
Yes, that's correct. So yeah, so this of course this is very evident on the early successes achieved by the Japanese, again in Singapore and Bataan, and however only a matter of time before they would know the shortcomings that would reflect in initiating wars over the very resources that they need, especially when they landed here in the Philippines. There are times also that, of course, due to lack of tanks, they use bicycles. So it would be much easier to go through the jungle and also small towns, same way that they did in Singapore. And also, but in the later part of the war, uh, that's the only time that they realized that their tanks are already obsolete, because the Japanese tanks are based only for the 1930s time, and of course during the later period of war, they're confronting already Sherman tanks or even Stuart tanks. There's no match for those tanks. It's like a hot knife on a butter for the Japanese. So yeah, that's the time that they realized that they're really obsolete. But the Japanese determination to win this war or to fight it out, it's uncomparable. And next slide, please. So yeah, the wartime developments, I believe this is for Diego and Don, but let me for a moment. Yeah, so wartime development, the guerrilla war, Japanese last-ditch measures, and American industrial juggernaut. You can see here, I believe that this is in Cebu, the photo where as early as 1942, we already have, of course, the time the Philippines actually, um, uh, well, actually fall from the Japanese war. And but as early as that, may mga guerrillas na tayo na nagpe-prep at and until 1944, of course, as you can see, there's American guy here, captured Japanese and Filipino guerrillas. Next
No,
slide.
wait, actually, the plate is of the Battle of Manila.
Yeah, that one.
Or wait,
That's
were you talking about the second slide
Okay.
of the guerrillas?
yes,
So
yes.
Oh, wait.
okay, this one is Intramuros. So that's the Battle of
Yes.
Manila.
Mm.
Okay. And of course, that would have been with the Navy, but that's another thing
Of
altogether.
course.
Okay.
Wait,
Yes.
just to wrap up this part of our presentation, the war didn't stay the same. We had 4 years of war in the Philippines from late 41 to late 45, and so we will cover the rapid development for the guerrilla war, the Japanese measures to keep fighting, and the American industrial might overcoming the Japanese. And next slide.
Okay.
We have a picture of guerrillas here. First, we'll cover the guerrilla war. You can see the picture on the screen. We have a group of guerrillas and two Japanese prisoners. If you were to look at the man behind them, he's wearing an M1 helmet. It's the American helmet as we know today. It's not the British helmet. It's not the ones they used in the early war. So
Kelly. Yeah.
this notes that this picture was taken late war. This was already late war. The Americans have arrived. But if you were to look at the guerrillas themselves, that was more or less how they looked for most of the war. Many of them, for the most part, wore civilian clothing. They came from all walks of life. Next slide.
Just to point this out, okay, in the context of the Wartime Heritage Guild and its reenactments, okay, you would look at the guerrilla in the leftmost. So he's wearing shorts, and the shirt that he is wearing, okay, that's a locally manufactured Japanese army shirt. So the
Oh,
likelihood is he nicked that off a dead Japanese.
oh yeah, the pockets are different. I always
The
assumed
pockets
it
are
was
different, right?
the PA short sleeve
Yeah.
ones. But yeah, the pockets are Japanese. Yeah.
Yeah. When it comes to the Japanese occupation, okay, it would be nice to point out that the Japanese supply system, the
I
Japanese
don't know.
supply
I believe that's
situation.
the part for the Japanese part. That's the
Okay,
last.
yeah. Oh, okay, yeah.
That'll come
Okay.
later.
All right, yeah. You
Anyway,
can pull this
next
up
slide.
in, yeah.
Yes. Anyway, the guerrilla war in the Philippines, it started even before Bataan fell. There were already groups who saw their towns and their territories being occupied by the Japanese, and they knew that they had to resist. However, the supply situation was different because we were cut off from the Americans. And so the look and the equipment of all these guerrilla groups really depended on where they managed to source their material. You had early war stragglers and weapons caches. The picture in the middle, actually, it's really interesting. This was a picture of the Maranao militia force in Mindanao. And if you were to look at them, except for their hats, well, some of them wear garrison hats, except for their hats, they more or less look like the early war Philippine army. And they're all well equipped with the BAR men at the front and the guy wearing a Kelly helmet on the lower right. It's safe to assume that a lot of these guys were part of the Philippine army who were never captured and carried on the fight after the official surrender. Of course, you also had raids against the enemy. One particular example is Hunter's ROTC and their raid on Union College in June of, if I remember right, June of 1942, where they took a lot of the weapons the Japanese captured from the USAFE forces who just surrendered, and then they brought them to supply the guerrilla forces. And of course, there was also resupply by submarine. The Americans would bring would try to gain contact with these guerrilla groups, give them medicines, bullets, weapons, and most importantly, radio sets, because they needed to communicate with the Americans. And lastly, of course, the return of the Americans. Once the Americans arrived late in October 1944 and later on in Luzon, once the guerrilla groups they recognized were contacted, well, they basically threw supplies at them. They gave them, they were as well armed and as well dressed as any other unit in the US Army by the time the Americans came. And now, next slide.
No, hang on.
Unless you want to add anything.
Yeah, the middle photo, that would be the Maranao guerrillas. Sorry, this was the 10th Military District under Wendell Fertig. So the reason why they are so well dressed is because when the US Army units, the regular units in Mindanao surrendered, they had stockpiles all over the island. So what they did was, as pointed out over there, early war stragglers and caches. The stockpiles were originally USAFE stockpiles, some khaki, some blue denim. And of course, especially in the cities around Misamis, Ozamis city, okay, it was secured against the Japanese. There was a garrison over there, but the underground, the resistant movement over there, was very active, and they stockpiled khaki cloth, and they were manufacturing khaki uniforms as well, and supplying the Mindanao guerrilla with what they had. On top of that, there were abandoned Japanese transports around the Davao Gulf. They were torpedoed or they were sunk one way or another. So these were also raided by the guerrilla.
Guerrillas. Yeah. Next slide to conclude the part about the guerrilla war. Filipino guerrillas would prove the most effective Allied resistance movement of the Pacific War. We were one of the most effective ones in the Southeast Asia region. Movements would not spring up in the other former colonies, partly because we were promised independence within 10 years' time after Tidings McDuffie. So unlike the other Southeast Asian countries, we already had independence to look forward to. And so we were fighting towards that. We were indispensable in tying up Japanese forces, gathering intelligence. If I were to mention one piece of intelligence that they gathered, it was very important, were the Koga papers. You can look that up when there's time. And of course, they also rescued downed Allied airmen. When the Americans would send their planes over here to do reconnaissance runs and hit Japanese forces, some of these planes would get shot down and the airmen will have to bail out. And so the guerrillas also rescued these airmen. When America returned in late 1944 and 1945, many of these groups would get absorbed and fight in large-scale battles alongside the Americans and would get equipped to the point that they more or less looked like the GIs they fought alongside. If you were to look at the picture to the right, that's a picture of the Wachi guerrillas, and they have the same helmets as the Americans when they returned. They had the same HBT uniforms, more or less indistinguishable, aside from the fact that they look Filipino or Chinese.
Yes, and next slide, please,
Okay.
Don.
All right, this is
All right.
the Japanese last-ditch measures.
So Japanese last-ditch measures. On the photo itself, you could see the lead Japanese or the officers actually wearing a American uniform. That's a wool olive drab uniform, and that's what they normally use when they have it's like captured weapons or materials that they have. And most of the time, they also use, of course, local materials. So uh, it's not all the time that they need to actually get the supply by from the ship coming from Japan or China, but they need to utilize the local materials. So mga local sastre, there are people or Filipinos here that are using the Japanese rather using the local materials pinapatahi dito sa Pilipinas. So next slide, please.
Okay, sorry. One thing Dan pointed out was the lead Japanese to the left. He's wearing a U.S. Army wool flannel shirt. Okay, because of the supply situation, supplies were not army supplies, military supplies were not reaching the Philippines as they should. So they were subcontracting local tailors, and likewise they were utilizing captured equipment. So you have that one guy over there wearing U.S. Army shirt, but if you would look at the guy to the right, okay, not pointed out as often, but he's wearing a captured Yusafi trousers. Right?
Yeah.
You can tell because of the belt loops. Japanese army trousers
Don't have belt
they
loops.
don't have
Yeah.
belt loops, and they were generally dark like these three guys in the middle. You would note the color, and this is not color this is not a result of the lighting. This is definitely Commonwealth Army trousers. Okay, and the shirt, it might well be captured as well. Okay, but definitely the trousers are Commonwealth.
Also, to give context sa topic ng talk na ito, there is also a time period that we need to mix match yung uniforms ng US and Japanese as well. It's not like as long as it's World War II, okay na yan. Hindi, it's not like that. So there's a time frame and there's context about it, why they wear it, and
Yes.
yun yung point din yan.
Correct. Okay. Dansang.
Yeah, so by the late landing, so October 1944, Japanese Empire seen a setback, and of course, this is due to submarine attacks on Japanese supply ships, and of course, as allies inch closer to the homelands, while individual fighting spirit, individual fighting spirit remained in an economic damage brought by over 7 years of continuous warfare made itself felt. So some factors which shaped the Japanese army of the late war years were follows: localized logistics. They are also using carabus, I believe, in Fukuoka, in Kyushu, when transporting Japanese aircraft pieces to a it's like yung assembly line. So it's not they don't put it on the truck. They use caraboos to save up gas and also material. So of course, localized logistics when it comes here to sa Philippines, like I mentioned, yung tela natin, local tela are being used, utilized, and also captured equipment and uniforms are also being utilized. Submarine blockade. Submarine blockade, this is very crucial sa supply nila, especially when, of course, shipping even from Taiwan. It's really hard to ship the equipment or materials to the Philippines to supply the Japanese. So what they did is they even use captured weapons, supplying it to the soldiers. You can see on the photo, of course, that's a hell ship being sunk down by a submarine, American submarine. Of course, the photo on the left is again the same photo in Cebu of the surrender. And on the right, you can see the photo of a sample of a Japanese Type 38 Arisaka rifle. Early rifles has a butt plate. It's a metal butt plate. But the last ditch weapons, you could see wala na siyang bakal. It's just wood. And sobrang last ditch na mga weapons na during the late war. And see, and
To
yeah,
provide
next.
further context as well, when the Japanese people make a big deal about getting a Japanese sword, the Japanese Army Gunto sword. Okay, how bad was the supply situation? Well, even the swords that are so treasured now, these were mass produced. They were made from truck springs. Okay, yung mga molye ng truck ginagawang espada. So people would be very delighted to own one, but in Japan itself, the value isn't really that much. What they would value would be the very old original government issue hand forged swords. Those are the ones that are valued. But the ones that would be found commonly, especially those being sold in antique shops, although they are old and their value is because of their age, they are not particularly valuable simply
They're
because
hardly heirloom pieces.
they are heirloom, but not really.
No, hardly. They're hardly.
They're hardly heirloom. Yeah, they're nice to have. They have a story behind them, right? But they're not particularly valuable, right? So that's a
Yes.
bit of antique collecting trivia for those who love it. Yeah.
Yes.
So you want something that is old, it's best to get into. You can ask us if you can, right? But the truth be told, some items, although they are old, that doesn't necessarily mean they are valuable because of age. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Next slide, please.
Next slide.
Okay.
Okay, so despite the great effort of Japanese fighting capabilities, inevitable crumbled. Of course, they're losing the war, while the forces arrayed against the empire only grew greater because, of course, from each occupied countries, besides the Americans or British or whatever country that they're fighting, the locals also are turning against them. So that's a great it's a big factor sa pag fail ng Japan sa occupation na to. And of course, that resorted to the Japan's homeland defense. Actually, you can see in the photo, of course, the H bomb, and below is the ano to eh. Actually, they're not students but local women. These are housewives, factory workers. Kaya they're being taught to fight using bamboo poles. This was also done here in the Philippines, by the way, around 1944. They are called bamboo brigade or kawayan brigada. I believe that's the term. Very similar to what is been taught in Japan. It's very more like a samurai era kind of defense. And just like they noted, if the Americans actually invaded by the sea, by land in Japan, it would be very costly because they're really prepared for this defense. That surrender came before the invasion of the Japanese homeland. Of course, could be opportunate for all sides involved. And of course, the American industrial juggernaut would be with Diego and Don, please.
Okay. Okay. Dan mentioned the Brigada Kawayan. Okay. In during the Japanese occupation, the Japanese Kempitai and the Japanese army, they worked together with the local pro-Japanese Filipinos, the Kalibapi, the Makapili, and so forth. Now, they mandated that every able-bodied man has to sign up and engage in these exercises where they would defend their neighborhoods with bamboo spears. I think there was a photograph. I think this has definitely be in somewhere in the city of Manila. I think it was either Santa Cruz or Santa Ana, where the Japanese were demonstrating out to the local barangay chieftain and the men in that barangay how to defend themselves with bamboo spears. Naturally, on the one hand, it's one thing to participate in these exercises. However, one of the biggest complaints of the Japanese administration in the Philippines before Yamashita came was that majority of the Filipinos were too pro-Western. Okay, and those that engaged in these exercises, well, these were the more pro-Japanese part, but when the invasion happened, those that engaged in these exercises who were initially pro-Japanese, they disappeared. Okay, they became the weekend guerrillas. So that provides some context. Now, next slide will be the American industrial juggernaut. Okay, previously we pointed out that the Japanese were very successful compared to the Chinese in arming themselves. Okay, the Japanese was one of the first Asian nations to industrialize on a scale as the Western countries. They had a capable navy, they had a capable army. However, what they did not have was the natural resources, which is why during World War II, and even prior to that, they wanted to take over China. They took over Korea. They did their best to invade Southeast Asia because of the rubber, the steel, the rubber, the oil, the tin, all the farm produce. That one was needed to prosecute the war in China and to make Japan an industrial superpower, more than they really needed to be, but that was the way it was. Now, the Americans at that time, they were the #1 car producing nation. They were industrializing, but their industry was more focused on consumer goods. So cars, trucks, tractors, ships, not necessarily naval ships, but shipping. Okay, the Axis powers were deriding the Americans. Same with the British. They were deriding the Americans because everything they had were very peaceful civilian items. What these powers did not realize, but what was very obvious to the likes of General Homma, Yamashita, the guy in the Iwo Jima movie, it was the industrial capacity of the U.S. What you could do was convert that productivity, that production, into military production at practically overnight, in a span of less than a year. All of that civilian production became military production. They were producing tanks, aircraft, bomber aircraft, aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, tanks, even more tanks, guns, ammunition. They outproduced every other country apart from the Soviet Union. They also supplied every other allied nation with what you have here: tanks, shipping, aircraft. The British would have were barely handing on. They were fighting the world alone before the Americans came in, and they were resupplied. When they were resupplied by the Americans, they took the fight to the Germans. The same with the Chinese. They were practically on the losing end until the British opened the Burma Road in India, and then the U.S. was supplying the Chinese with these weaponries. Now, in the Philippine context, how did that happen, Diego?
The next slide. Anyway, the Philippine context, we basically covered the guerrilla war, the supplying of guerrillas via submarine, and when the Americans returned. This segment is more of basically the sheer scale of American industry. It gave them air and naval supremacy. If you were to look at the picture on the left, that is, if I believe right, that is the shipyard in San Francisco, and that's
Kaiser
taken in
Shipyard.
1946. And basically, you can see all of the Navy ships that they built for the war. In the middle, you have all the aircraft. And they also streamlined their designs. If you were to look at the third picture, the lower half, you see a Thompson submachine gun from the early war. And the one that they used for most of the war, the M1A1 versus the M1928. The one on top is a simpler production. They made more of them. It was cheaper to produce, but was just as effective. And that was the thing. Unlike Japanese efforts, which were last ditch because we need to get something out there, the Americans, when things got cheaper, it was because they managed to get the same performance for the same cost. And so everything just flowed from their factories. And it's undeniable that this had an effect on how their soldiers looked, how they were equipped, how they performed in battle. Next slide. I guess you covered so many good points about American industrial might in the opening that I think we can go to the next slide. By the time that the Americans came back here, we see a few pictures. To the left are 105 howitzers
Sorry, hang
hitting
on.
Intramuros.
I think I backed that one up.
The middle there are American
And
M4
UST.
Sherman tanks, in the UST raid. And then, of course, to the right, you have the crossing of the Pasig River.
Yes.
The role of the United States in its industry during the Second World War cannot be understated. It shaped things as small as how their soldiers looked, the streamlining of their industry, the massive equipment they had. And it also shaped things as large as its post-war geopolitical standing. America was a superpower. World War II turned America into a superpower, and they can't return to isolationism, especially with the new Cold War. And because their industry was so massive, well, all the weapons, all the tanks, most of them, they didn't go back to America. They were just sold off or given to countries friendly or part of the American sphere of influence for the new Cold War. So that wraps up the part about American industrial might. Concluding slide, Don. The end. There's a few pictures of us during the trip in Bamban, the immersive event from last year in Bamban.
So,
Okay. All right, that ends the
concludes,
slideshow.
yeah.
Okay, now we're open for questions.
Sir Rancho?
Wait. Thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. We are now proceeding with the open forum. Now, we would like to feature you individually. So, if you
Let
don't
me.
mind, can we close the share screen?
Okay.
Yeah, okay, so that everyone will be able to see you. Right. So we have several questions. Now, I'd like to remind everybody that the floor is open for any question. So for Zoom participants, feel free to raise your questions in the Q&A button or in the chat button below. And if you are a if you're a Facebook live participant, you can also raise your question in the comment sections below. Now, we have several questions. The first is, at the start of the webinar, you state, see Mr. Don Fernandez stated that the Americans were the good guys while the Japanese were the bad guys. Would you care to, elaborate, aside from the obvious, of course?
Mhm.
Can we say the same thing, considering that we are merely replacing one colonial master with another colonizer?
Okay, good question. Um, when the Americans came in 1898, right, they did not know what exactly to do with the Philippines, right? They had no idea where the country was. They everything was done on the fly. Their only purpose here was to defeat the Spanish Navy. They had nothing else to follow afterward. When
Yes.
independence was declared in 1898, even even Aguinaldo himself was resigned to the fact that he might as well accommodate the Americans here as they were. Unfortunately, the war happened. The American War happened. The Philippines lost its independence. Even then, the Americans did not know what to do with the Philippines. So they decided, if we have it, might as well put it to good use. We'll be giving them independence at one time or another anyway. Okay? In that, keeping that in mind, okay? The Japanese, on the other hand, they were intending to occupy the Philippines as a prefecture since since the time the Japanese Navy became an expeditionary force. In 1898, when the Spanish when the Spanish Navy was fighting it out with the U.S. Navy in Manila Bay, among the countries that wanted to get the spoils, whichever one lost the fight, was the Japanese. They had warships getting ready, along with the British Navy and the German Navy. Okay, the Japanese themselves, because they were late in the colonial expansion, in the race for colonial expansion, they already aimed to get more than they already had when they got Taiwan. They got Taiwan in 1898. They got Korea in 1910. They aimed to occupy at least Eastern China and incorporate that into the Japanese Empire, and the Philippines, Malaya, and French Indochina as well. Okay? And they did not intend to grant any of these nations any independence. They were part of the Japanese army,
It's more
the
of
Japanese empire.
annexation.
Annexation, complete and utter annexation. Okay, in that sense, the U.S. was the good guy, because they said 1945, 1946, upon the expiry of the Tidings-McDuffie Act, Philippines will be an independent nation, for better or for worse, whichever it aligns with, preferably with the United States. That's their problem in 1946, when and if that when that eventually happens. For the Japanese, though, the moment they became an imperial power after defeating the Russians in 1905, they decided Asia is for Asians, preferably with the emperor, with the Japanese emperor headquarters in Tokyo and Beijing, ruling over East Asia, the Great East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was Japanese.
And of course, besides these points, you have to admit that, well, I mean, speaking to the general public, I think the good guy and bad guy comment with any war, actually, it's more of a tongue-in-cheek thing. We have the public perception of who were good and who were bad. But that is besides the valid points that Don put forward. So the comment was made a bit tongue-in-cheek too.
Right. Next
Okay,
question,
so-
please.
Yes, so I can also accommodate comments. So if you have any comments, pwede rin po. So we have one from Facebook. So we have from Ma'am Sandy Martinez. Sabi po niya, learning a lot of new things. Kudos to the Wartime Heritage Guild.
Thank
Oh,
you.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I see in our Zoom attendee list that there are people who are raising their hands. Now, I'd like to encourage you to simply write your questions or comments in the comment section below, and also we have a Q&A button below so that we can acknowledge you. Right, so second question. This is a personal question, actually, if you don't mind.
Mhm.
Now, I'd like the three of you to respond to this. what inspired you personally to become the enactors in the first place?
Mm. Who would like to go first?
Dan, you start.
Yeah, so of course everything started from yung mga lola lolo, since that it's a first hand experience na na-imagine mo what's happening ganyan. And of course turns out na may sa father side yun nga may relative na veteran, and also sa mother side may Japanese na ano kami, grandfather na in the military. So he was a spy here in the Philippines. So this for me personally na inspires me to um dig more about the history on our local history. That's why we call it as a heritage. It's well, talagang heritage natin 'yan. Because basically all the people who experienced this war, they're almost gone. So we need to continue, and by doing reenactment or doing public historical talks, this would help to ano yung continue yung legacy nila ng what they experience. So at least hindi natin malilimutan yung mga experiences nila.
What you done? What inspired you to take up reenacting?
I had too much time in my hands. So if I were to reenact, might as well reenact and do something good. Okay. The main driver with it, because I'm an avid follower of history, right? And what drove me into this was there were simply too many comic book stories about the war. Okay. And many of these stories were built on narratives which were inaccurate. So, like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there is narrative, salaysay. There is experience, karanasan. Many of these are either exaggerated or underrepresented or distorted presentations of what actually happened. Okay, so one example I could tell you was I think many of our audience would be familiar with it. Yung mga Koreano, masusungit sila. Okay, but based on the documents of the Korean Army itself, the Republic of Korea Army, the Japanese Army, the Imperial Archives, and research by I can't recall her name, Prof. Rico's late wife. They did research on the involvement of Koreans in the war, and the fact of the matter is Koreans were not much participating in the Philippines. Okay,
In Manila, specifically in Manila.
Yeah.
Or on
If
Taiwanese.
it was more of the Taiwanese that were here. Matter of fact, Korea as a nation, although it existed, nobody in the Philippines knew what the Korean was. Even the name Korea in that time and age did not exist. Okay, it was Chosen. No one knew what Korea was. The Japanese called it Chosen. The Koreans called it Chosen. So that story about masungit, mabangis mga Koreano, that's not real. What drove me into reenacting, especially the Japanese bit, was to maybe a small urge to straighten out the narratives. Okay.
As for me, how I got into reenacting. Well, when I was much younger, I was well read. My parents and grandparents made sure of that, and I took an interest in history. I like reading about history, and the World War II always got my interest. It was the last big war, and I just read and watched movies, and but that doesn't answer the question how I got into reenacting. That answers the question how I'm interested in this time period. What got me into thinking about reenacting or even finding out about it was I think I was in second grade. I was playing a video game about World War II, and I decided to look up images of how the soldiers actually looked from that time. So I got on my dial-up connection and looked it up. And well, yeah, I saw pictures. I saw pictures from people abroad. dressed up the same way they were in the 40s, reenacting battles. And that's when I realized, well, okay, people did this. And so even at the second grade, I knew when I grew up, I wanted to do this.
So there's a comment, James William B. Burgos, James William Burgos Coronado, right? Active participation, Japanese resistant, served in the Anderson. Thank you for the service. From the time induction 24 until discharge from the service at organization 1945. James William Burgos Coronado, thank you very much. Could you relay this to your ancestor, whether in spirit or in actuality? Okay. Any others, please? Melanie Melendez. Yes. What's your query, Miss? Hello.
Hi, Miss Melanie. You can write your question
Yes,
comment
please.
section and naka-raise yung hand mo. Okay, we have another question. Earlier, as you were discussing, it seems like the procurement process for feeding a wartime machinery would have been such a big undertaking. Now, do we have information on that? Do we have information? Do we have data on the suppliers, on the raw materials? Yeah. And do we have any information about this?
All right. Number one is when it came to supplying items directly from Japan to the Philippines. All right. The primary sources would be the National Diet Library of Japan. Bless them. They have the shipping tables over there, along with archives from the U.S. Coast Guard, the Japanese Coast Guard, and lo and behold, even the Republic of China on Taiwan archives, because many of the shipping documents that were based on the Japanese merchant fleet, they had to go through Taiwan anyway. So that's one. On the other hand, when it came to feeding the army, the Japanese army, although they had a ration system similar to any army at that time, canned goods and wet and dry rations, the rations that were issued to them were last resort rations. In other words, they would only use them when they were starving. The doctrine of the Japanese army was to forage, to rely on local supply for anything that they needed, which is why when it came to the occupation, they would confiscate the rice harvest, they would confiscate chickens, goats, cows, and put them for army use. It became so drastic that there was rice being stored in warehouses in Pangasinan for army and military use only. In the meantime, people in Batangas were starving. Okay, so everything that could be used was used for the Japanese army. Fabric was used again, was rationed. Okay, raw fabric, cotton, especially cotton, and rayon. Ano yun? Rayon I forgot the local term for rayon, right? Made from wood pulp. Okay, these were rationed very much. You could not manufacture anything. You had to get it from the army. You had to get permission from the army commissary to make any new cloth, which is why if you would, the old people that we have spoken with, they had to recycle, repatch, sew together any clothing that they have, right? And that is only because they had no that if they had any clothing left. Okay.
For the American case, it's rather simple, as Don put it. The civilian industry got converted for wartime production. You had rifles made by IBM, tanks made by General Motors. You had Wrigley chewing gum and Hershey's chocolate bar in the soldiers' rations. So as simple as that. Civilian industry converted to military.
Yeah, and they have the biggest industrial might. So even before the war, the Japanese knew about this, especially those Japanese who studied in Uh, yeah, in the States. So from basing it from the number of cars in this in America, from there alam na nila na they would fail.
We have a question here, but this was already answered kanina. Pero I would like to hear more about this because this is something like a very interesting tidbit. No, why jeans as uniform for allied forces in the Philippines? Anything about the material suited well for combat? No, nabanggit
The,
ng jeans, no, na maong.
the
And
blue denim.
yeah,
I don't know. Actually, that's an interesting note, and I brought something here with me. This is an officer's hat, or at least that's what. Yeah, it is an officer's hat. It's a visor cap, right? Every time I go to Intramuros wearing it, they would say, it's a general or something or an officer. And while it is badged for an officer, technically the enlisted men were supposed to have that too. In a perfect world, all of these uniforms was basically, were built for purpose. In the case of yung maong, it's a work uniform. Ayaw mo namang marumihan yung khakis mo, or you don't want to reduce wear and tear when you're doing digging or construction work. And so technically, lahat ng sundalo nung time na yun may work uniform. And yung maong, it was durable. It wasn't meant for combat. Pero dahil sa shortages ng early warriors, ginamit siyang pang combat. But in truth, everyone was supposed to have one, and it wasn't supposed to be used for combat.
And it's more durable. Maong, of course, the maong it's maong. So more durable siya. Naglalast.
We have a question from Micaela Cao. Any insights on the uniforms worn by the Aztec Eagles from Mexico in the Philippines?
The Aztec Eagles from Mexico, arriba, right? They wore what the U.S. Army Air Forces wore, same exact uniforms,
Yes.
except
No
for the
difference.
formal. No difference. Even the formal uniforms were U.S. Army uniforms, but with Mexican insignia.
Yes, just the markings,
Just the markings were
patches
different, yeah.
or whatever art they would like to use on their jackets, something
Mhm.
like that. But it's a standard issue uniform that they're using.
Yeah,
And
standard
of course, it
US
goes,
Army. Yeah.
It goes back to the industrial might question. You have men who are trained or are willing to fight. Well, the Americans will give you the uniforms and weapons to do so. And the airplanes were American too.
Yeah. So apart from the Mexicans, of course, there were other nationalities. There was the Brazilians who were fighting in Europe. They were supplied exclusively with U.S. Army equipment, and the French also. When they went back to France, they were equipped with a mix of British and U.S. Army uniforms. But when they came here, when they came back to their colony here in Indochina, they were very much wearing U.S. Army surplus as well. So the effect of that in the U.S. industrial capacity, we feel it until today. If you would look at the surrendered weapons of the NPA, it always inevitably includes some old U.S. Army stuff. So there's a garand every now and then. Okay.
Now
So yeah.
Now let's go back to reenactment.
Mhm.
Is it an expensive hobby? Like, how much do you need per reenactor?
It would depend.
Oh my! Do I really
It-
want to put this on
It
record?
would depend. All right. If you were portraying,
Lalabas expenditures namin dyan.
yeah, if you were researching the Japanese, right, it's straightforward. It's not as expensive as it should be because much of it anyway was locally manufactured here as well when the supply situation became difficult. With the early Philippine army, right? Again, it's not so expensive, right? It's maong. So maong fabric is not so expensive even today. Okay. However, the hardcore parts, if you were going to portray the U.S. Army of 1944 coming back with MacArthur, that one will cost some, right? It will cost some. We are fortunate because the U.S. Army steel helmets are fairly common. U.S. Army aluminum canteens are fairly common, right? There's some airsoft here and there, but otherwise, yes, it can be expensive.
I guess all I'm willing to say on the matter was, if you were to look at the WHG's allied segment who do late war American equipment, let's just say it took all pandemic to put that together. The research and the purchasing and the saving up. It took, yeah, basically we were just at home
Yeah.
for 3 years.
2 years,
It took
yeah.
us 2 years to put it together. And that's at a fast rate. Other impressions I built, I took 5 years to put together or research. It's really taxing, but that's the thing. You want to do this. You want to get it right. And if you saw it, you read it. If you have the drive to, you'll do it.
Yeah, let's put it this way. Kung if regarding about the question kung magkano ano for a uniform around 4,000 almost 5,000 it would cost. Hindi pa kompleto 'yon. So wala pa yung mga ammo belt, ganyan. So it really takes na yung passion mo dito na kung talagang gusto mong i-pursue yung
It's not an
realistic.
overnight thing.
Yeah, it's not an overnight. If you want realism, you have to, of course, you have to spend for it.
Yeah, we have another question here about reenactment. Now, can it be considered as a form of performance art?
Definitely.
It's a one form of performance art. Now when we're talking about the reenactments per se, let's say you have a big reenactment event with pyrotechnics, people running around, it can become a very visual kind of performance art. Okay, this happened several times in the past, especially over at the old PC barracks down at Fort Intramuros over at Santa Lucia Barracks. You have large numbers of reenactors would be engaging in shootouts, right? Yes, it is a form of performance art. There are, however, a bit more of the hardcore part. This goes beyond the performance art. This is usually done in private. This would be the immersions, right? So you have our group would do an immersion. We go into the hills, no audience, and we would do practical experiments on what equipment that we have that is period correct. Okay.
Also to add on that, we actually need to also do research on how they move, yung mga ganyan, lahat ng details eh.
Mhm.
So it is performance art. So inaaral namin talaga 'yun.
Mhm.
Kasi you don't especially when handling weapons, hindi pa pwede yung parang security guard ka na yung ganun na itsura.
Yeah, I mean, it would really ruin everything. Even if you had
Yeah.
like all the money to spend on the nicest equipment, you
Yeah.
hold your gun like it's the 2020s, and it just ruins the look.
Yeah.
You have to study these
It's a dead
things.
giveaway.
Mhm. So it in a way it goes beyond performance art. There's a point it goes performance art, but then there is that. Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not. I wouldn't say it's higher. I would say it's a separate thing, and you have to
Yeah.
satisfy everything.
Yeah.
now building on that, if it can be considered as a form of art, would there be room for innovation and creativity?
It's very narrow. Again, it's based primarily on people's salaysay, kasaysayan, and karanasan. Yeah, that's where it will be narrow. You would recall that I mentioned earlier, it's not cosplay. Cosplay is about the person doing the cosplay. That's where it can strictly be said it's performance art. They can do anything they want, right? They can have liberties with it. Yeah. But with the others, right? It's there's a narrow interpretation.
Yeah, kung it's more like baka pwede pa maging stage play na lang kung talagang gusto nilang may additional na artistic na na idagdag sa isang narrative or isang part ng history. So reenactment is also different, of course, with stage play, even though if they're portraying the same story.
Mhm.
So yun yung difference din.
Now going back to the uniforms during the war. Now, clearly, form followed function, and military uniforms are very practical. Now, but was there ever room for aesthetic purely for aesthetic sake?
Wait, I think I can answer this. this one from the I didn't mention it no interwar part, but one of the effects both budget and aesthetics had on US uniforms was their early war service boot. Hindi ko nalagyan ng picture yung slideshow, but anyway, basically the US Army could only afford to give its soldiers one boot. And so that's why you have the leggings. You see the canvas gaiters we have on our legs when we're at Intramuros. Kasi yung US Army boot ng time na yon, it didn't provide any calf support. Rocks sometimes got in, water got in. Pero they insisted na yung boots nila, their combat boots, for lack of a better word at the time, should also be good for parade, should also be good for the dance floor. The men shall have one boot and it shall be good for anything. And if they're in combat, you just slap yung canvas gaiters.
Industrial use.
To provide support so that water and rocks don't get into the boot. Pero yun, aesthetics played a massive part in the development of that boot. And in the end, nung nag-gear up na nga yung US, hello?
Yeah.
Nung nag-gear up na nga yung US, they developed boots that were actually just meant for combat, and they had enough of a surplus na the men got a boot for combat and the men got a boot for the parade and the dance floor. So they were that well supplied. In the end they got both boots. Pero when they started the war, they had the one boot, and it had to be both aesthetically pleasing, even though they had to do things like the gaiters to make it also practical.
So also on the issue of aesthetically pleasing, okay, colonial armies, whether it's Malaysia, the Philippines, the Vietnamese, they tend to follow the style of whichever colonial power governed or dominated them. So in the case of the Philippines, aesthetically we followed the American style. We did try to follow, even in the 1898 period, with the old Republic Army, they followed the Spanish style. But then again, it's a trend across the world that we would try to keep up with the more modern militaries that we have that influence us anyway. So if you would look at the Philippine Army, they followed the U.S. Army style, even past World War II. And that trend continues today. If you would look at every military today, they all look like the U.S. Army, whether they like it or not. You go to get combat footage of the Ukraine war, everyone looks like they came out of the U.S. Army fighting in Iraq. So whether it's the Russian or Ukrainian, it's human nature. They would like to be badass. They would like to look cool, and that's how aesthetics came into play.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So unfortunately, we are running out of time. So we have one last question. Where can we go if we wish to learn more about military uniforms from the Second World War? Are there any museums locally that are specifically for period clothing?
There was the old AFP museum. I doubt if they're still open.
Yeah,
Right.
they're still, yeah.
Yeah, they have
They are.
a set of uniforms over there. If there's something more specific, especially World War II, I think the one in Bamban, they have World War II Japanese uniforms over there. There is that new museum coming up in Bulacan. Which museum was that, Dan?
There's no display yet. So
No displays yet.
yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
And any military museum anywhere, the nicest ones that I know of would be over at the Fort del Pilar Museum in Baguio. And there's a smaller museum also there's that big museum over at Taguig, the Philippine Veterans Bank building. They have an excellent display of equipment and uniforms over there. You have the Philippine Air Force Museum down at Villamor Air Base. I'm not sure if there's a Philippine Navy Museum. I'm sure they probably have one.
In
but then again,
Villamor, there are uniforms there as well. So that's one thing. Yeah.
Yep. And anything earlier than that, there are private collections, which are too numerous to mention over here, but we'd probably type it up somewhere. Yeah.
And hopefully we
Um,
can have another show and tell in Fort Santiago.
oh, yes.
Yes.
Yes, definitely.
Very
By
definitely.
apologies for switching out my camera. Phone's running out of battery, so.
Yeah.
So, anyone else would be interested in engaging in reenactment, or at least what we do? You can contact us through our website. That's the Wartime Heritage Guild.
Mhm.
You can send a private message over there. We'll get in
Mm.
touch with you. Okay, and every once a month, we would be having our own little thing going on over at Fort Santiago at the Intramuros Administration
Mm.
premises. So thank you very much to our online audience. We hope we have been
Thank
good
you.
help to
Yes,
you.
thank you. Thank you.
And thank you to the Intramuros Administration.
And also, Sir Ransha, I'll just greet our friends from Bulacan, from Sikhai Film Productions, and Miss Martinez as well is currently watching. So hi,
Hello.
thank you.
Right. So the Facebook of Part-Time Heritage Guild is in the screen. So just search for them and feel free to follow the page of Part-Time Heritage Guild. Also, I'd like to promote our social media channels. The Intramuros Administration is available on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And I'd like to announce that Intramuros has been nominated as Asia's Leading Tourist Attraction Award. Help us win again this year by voting. Voting is on until July 23. Also, get the latest updates on Intramuros by joining our Viber community. Scan the QR code in the screen or go to bit.ly/IA Viber. IA Viber is all caps. So that's it for this episode of the Intramuros Learning Session. So this is episode number 89. Now, one last. Mayroon po ba kayong mga final na mensahe para sa ating mga viewers?
I always look forward to always look back to history, right? You might it's not about history repeating itself, but there will always be echoes of history. Always study history. We encourage that, and visit your local museum.
Local museums, of course, Intramuros. Visit
Yep.
Intramuros. You could always see us there every month. And it's ano lang yan, lapit lang, puntahan lang natin sa Manila. So that's history na.
Yep.
Heritage natin yan. So
Yes.
alagaan natin.
Support your museums, please.
Thank you so much, dear speakers, and thank you everyone for watching. Until the next Intramuros Learning Sessions. Till next time.
Thank
you.
you,
Thanks,
guys.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, thank you.